Two scenes, 70 years apart, in the same family. The first one, early in the 4th century, a man is sitting in a small house at night with the shutters closed. Under one of the flagstones in his floor, there is a letter, a copy, worn soft at the folds, and he takes it out when the street is quiet and reads it aloud to about a dozen people who came in one at a time. If the wrong person learns that stone is loose, he will lose his property, and possibly his life, and certainly the lives of some of the people in that room. That is what it costs to own a page of scripture in the year he is living in. The second scene, the end of the same century. His grandson is a Christian too. Same faith on paper, same book, the same phrases in the same language. But he holds an office. He is paid out of public money. He travels at state expense. And if a neighbor disagrees with him about a sentence of doctrine, that neighbor can be reported and fined and removed from his city by imperial decree. Same family, same faith on paper, 70 years. What happened in between is one of the most consequential things that has ever happened to Christianity, and almost none of us were taught it, because it is not a heresy and it is not a scandal. It is a legalization. And before I say one more word, let me be honest about the good in it, because if I pretend otherwise, I have no business teaching anything. When the persecution stopped, people stopped being killed. Mothers stopped burying children over a confession of faith. Men stopped losing their hands in mines. Bibles stopped having to live under floors. That is a mercy, and I am not going to sneer at a mercy from a comfortable chair 17 centuries later. And let me say the second thing. You know the emperor's name. I am not going to spend this video on him because I am genuinely not interested in him as a man. Historians have argued about his motives for a very long time, and that argument is not my subject. I am interested in what happened to the church. So I am going to call him the emperor and keep my eyes on the room, not the throne. So here is what today is. 3 things changed in that century, and all 3 are still shaping the building you sat in last Sunday. First, the church acquired a sword. Second, and this is the strongest of the 3, so stay for it, the shepherd became a magistrate, and I am going to show you the verse where Jesus names that exact model and forbids it out loud. And third, doctrine became something a government could enforce, which does something to belief that most people have never thought through. And this is exactly the kind of change Paul spent his life watching for. Writing to the churches in Galatia, he says, I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ, unto another gospel. So soon. And then the heaviest sentence in his letters, that even if he himself or an angel from heaven brought a different gospel, let him be accursed. Galatians chapter 1. He knew the faith would rarely be attacked from outside. It gets renovated by friends with the best of intentions in a single generation. Before the first one, 2 quick things, and then I will not interrupt the scripture again until the end. First, make sure you are already subscribed, so the next one does not slip past you. And tell me in the comments which city you are watching from tonight. I read them, all of them, and I pray for the names of the places I see. And second, let me be honest about where this comes from. What I am about to walk you through, I did not learn in a seminary. I learned it the hard way, at a kitchen table with an open Bible and a stack of history, after years of being handed conclusions instead of centuries. I wrote all of it down, every verse, every test, in a short guide I called Be Your Own Pastor. Keep the title in the back of your mind. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why I had to write it. Now, the first one. And here is the one thing I want you to carry out the door, because all 3 changes are the same change wearing different clothes. Persecution had been doing a job that nobody noticed, and when it stopped, nothing replaced it. For 3 centuries, being a Christian cost you something, which meant nobody joined for advantage and nobody rose in the church for career reasons. There was no career. Take that away in a single decade, and for the first time in history, the church becomes a place where an ambitious man can get somewhere. Nobody voted for that. Nobody even noticed it happening. But every one of the 3 changes we are about to walk through grows out of it. Part 1. The church acquired a sword. And I want to start with Jesus, in front of a Roman governor, being asked a direct political question. John chapter 18, verse 36. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, Read the logic of that sentence, because he is not being poetic. He is stating a cause and an effect. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. He ties worldly kingdom and fighting servants together as the same thing, which means the moment a church has men who fight for it, that church has become, in the exact sense Jesus meant, of this world. And he had already demonstrated it on the worst night of his life. In the garden, a disciple draws a sword to defend him, not to conquer a country, not for revenge, but to protect Jesus himself from an unjust arrest. If there has ever been a legitimate occasion for religious violence in the history of the world, that was it. And Matthew chapter 26, verse 52, "Put up again thy sword into his place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." He forbids it at the one moment when it would have been most defensible. Now put the history beside those verses. In the space of about one lifetime, the faith went from being unable to protect its own scrolls to being able to remove a man from his city for disagreeing with a sentence. And notice, it did not need to build an army to do that. It only needed to be near one. Proximity to a sword is enough. Once the state is friendly, you no longer have to persuade a man. You can have him relocated. And any group that can do that will eventually do it, because it is faster than persuading him, and every generation has someone in a hurry. Part 2. The shepherd became a magistrate. And this is the strongest of the three, because Jesus did not merely warn about it in general terms. He described the specific model and forbade it, out loud, to the men who would lead the first church. Luke chapter 22. It is the last night. The disciples are arguing about which of them is the greatest, and Jesus answers them like this, verses 25 and 26. "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But ye shall not be so. But he that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he that is chief, as he that doth serve." Stop and see what he just did. He points at the imperial system, the kings of the Gentiles, the whole Roman apparatus of rank and authority and titles running downward from a throne. And he says, "But ye shall not be so." He names the model and rules it out. He does not say be gentler versions of that. He says, do not be that. And then read the 4th century. Bishops receive imperial privileges. They travel at public expense. They are giving judicial functions, actual legal authority over disputes. Their seats begin to align with the administrative map of the empire, so that the shape of church government starts to mirror the shape of provincial government, because that is the only organizational template anybody in that world had. And at the most famous assembly of that century, it is the emperor who convenes it and presides over the opening, a thing no apostle ever did, asked for, or imagined. Now hold that against Luke 22. The church did not slide into the very structure Jesus pointed at and prohibited by accident, and it did not do it out of wickedness. It did it because the moment you are legal, you are given a filing cabinet, and filing cabinets come in one shape in an empire. But whatever the reason, "Ye shall not be so" was said about precisely that shape. And the apostles kept saying it. Peter, writing to elders in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 3, "Neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being ensamples to the flock." Not lords, examples. And Jesus, in Matthew 23, verses 8 to 10, deals with the titles themselves. "Be not ye called rabbi, and call no man your father upon the earth. Neither be ye called masters." 3 titles, 3 prohibitions, in one paragraph. Now count how many honorific titles exist in the church structures that came out of that century. And this is exactly the kind of thing I had to dig out for myself, alone. Because a man whose position depends on a structure is rarely the man who will show you the verse that forbids the structure. It is the reason the second protocol in that short guide I wrote is about testing an office against scripture rather than against tradition. But back to the history, because there is a third change, and it is the one that reaches into your own head. Part 3. Doctrine became enforceable. And here I want to make an argument that is not historical at all. It is logical, and I think it is unanswerable. Belief that is compelled is not belief. If the state can require a confession and attach a fine or an exile to the wrong answer, then within one generation, you can no longer tell the difference between a church full of believers and a church full of people who have correctly filled in a form. The words are identical. The buildings are fuller than ever. In fact, they fill up enormously in that century. and everyone at the time reads that as revival. But the mechanism that produced the fullness is no longer conviction. It is advantage, and its twin, risk avoidance. And Scripture is emphatic that the Christian arsenal does not include this tool. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. Not carnal, not material, not physical, not coercive. Paul is defining the toolkit by exclusion, and a magistrate's power is the most carnal weapon there is. And notice what the standard is for testing doctrine in the New Testament. It is never an authority. It is the message itself. Galatians 1. Though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached, let him be accursed. Even the apostle, even an angel, the message judges the messenger, always. And in that system, there is nothing for a magistrate to do, because you cannot deputize a court to judge a message. And Paul goes further in a passage almost nobody quotes in this context. Romans chapter 14, verse 5, dealing with a genuine dispute between Christians about days and food. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Fully persuaded in his own mind. That is Paul's instruction for handling disagreement. Not a ruling, not a penalty, not a register of who complied. Persuasion, individually, internally, which is the exact opposite of enforceability, and it is written by the most authoritative letter writer in church history. And there is one detail from that century that I think says more than any decree, and it is small. In the same generation, the man who wore the crown began to be spoken of in language that had until then belonged to worship, his portrait treated with reverence, his presence described in the vocabulary of the sacred, his seat placed at the front of a Christian assembly. Nobody had to write that down as doctrine. It simply became normal, because in that world, power and holiness had always been described with the same words, and nobody stopped to separate them again. And that is how a structure enters a church, not by argument, but by furniture and vocabulary. Somebody puts a chair at the front. Somebody uses an honorific because it feels rude not to. Nobody writes a doctrine, and nobody objects. And in 40 years, it is simply the way things are. And in 400, it is unquestionable. Which is exactly why the only defense a Christian has ever had against it is the ability to open the book himself and read what was said about greatness on the last night. So let us put the three together. The church acquired a sword, and Jesus had tied fighting servants to worldly kingdoms in one breath. The shepherd became a magistrate, and Jesus had pointed at that exact imperial model and said, "Ye shall not be so." And doctrine became enforceable, in a faith whose weapons are explicitly not carnal, and whose own instruction for disagreement is that every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. And all three are the same change. The cost of being a Christian was removed and replaced with a benefit. That is the whole hinge of the century. And notice that nobody in that generation could see it, because from the inside, it looked like everything good happening at once. The killing stopped, the churches filled, the buildings went up, and the emperor himself sat in the room. If you had told a believer in that decade that something had just gone badly wrong, he would have thought you were mad, and I am not certain I would have seen it either. Now, let me be careful, because I owe you the fair side of this. It is not as if nothing good came out of that century. Scripture could be copied openly and in quantity. Christians could care for the sick and the poor at a scale they had never been permitted before. The persecution genuinely ended. Anyone who tells this story as pure catastrophe is telling it dishonestly, and I am not going to do that to you. But here is what I want you to weigh. Every one of those good things is a change in circumstances, and every one of the three problems is a change in structure, in who has power over whom, and how it is exercised. Circumstances change back. Structures do not. Persecution returned to many places in later centuries. The hierarchy, the titles, the enforceability, and the nearness to the sword never went away. We inherited the structure, not the safety. So what does this cost you on an ordinary Sunday, 17 centuries later? It costs you a default assumption that you have probably never examined, that spiritual authority naturally comes in the shape of an office, that ordinary believers are the governed rather than the priesthood, and that the way to settle a disagreement about the Bible is to find out what the person with the position says. None of that came from the apostles. It came from a filing cabinet an empire handed to a church that had just been let out of prison and was too grateful and too relieved to ask what shape it was. So let me ask you the real question, and I want you to answer it honestly, in the quiet, before you do anything else. What does your faith cost you right now? Not in feeling, in fact. Is there anything you do because you are convinced of it that costs you standing, money, comfort, or approval? Because for 300 years, being a Christian cost everybody something. And the moment it started paying instead, the church filled up with people who could not tell the difference. And that is the question, not for a 4th century congregation, but for you and for me. If our faith currently costs us nothing at all, then we have no way of knowing which of the two we are. And if that landed on you, if you have never once been asked to examine an office, a title, or a structure by the book, and underneath it the deeper fear of standing before God one day, having conformed perfectly, and hearing the most terrible sentence in the whole Bible when Jesus says to religious, certain people, "I never knew you. Depart from me," then let me point you toward the next step, because I am not going to leave you with only a feeling. Everything we walk through today, I wrote out plainly in that short guide, Be Your Own Pastor. It is where I put the 3 protocols in order: how to read scripture for yourself with nobody standing between you and God, how to test an office or a title against the text rather than against tradition, and how to make the decisions of your own faith without asking a man's permission. I even put the verses on the priesthood of every believer in there, in the original Greek. I am not going to put a number on it here. Go and see for yourself. It is linked right below this video, and there is a code on your screen right now that takes you straight to it. I made it for the believer who is done depending on any pulpit but Christ's. Now, before we close, if this channel has been feeding something real in you, do 2 small things for me. Make sure that subscribe button is on and the bell with it, so the next thing I open finds you. And if you want to help us put this in front of people who have never been told that the shape of their church came from an empire, you can tap join and become a member of this ministry. Think of it only as sowing into the work, nothing more than that. And if you cannot, you are still family here, fully. Either way, stay. The next video I am putting in front of you right now is the honest next step from here. Because once the shepherd became a magistrate, somebody had to decide what an ordinary believer was no longer allowed to do. Go watch it while this is still burning in you. And until then, remember the grandfather with the loose flagstone. And remember that he owned no office and had no title, and that the whole faith survived 3 centuries in the hands of people exactly like him. May the peace of Christ, whose kingdom is not of this world, and who told us plainly not to be so, keep your heart and your mind until we open the Word together again.